Medieval people once tried to excommunicate caterpillars in a court of law. This is just one of the many forgotten acts we are about to uncover. You are going to discover 25 of the most bizarre lost rituals that defy all logic, from a world where the line between prayer and magic was utterly blurred. We will see how communities faced plagues, famine, and fear with ceremonies that seem shocking, brilliant, or completely bewildering to us now. How did a festival of throwing cats from a tower last for centuries? What drove hundreds to dance themselves to death in the streets? By the end, you will understand the desperate and dazzling creativity of the medieval mind when confronted with the unknown. What do you think drives people to create rituals in the face of the inexplicable? The logic behind such a ritual is as startling as the act itself. To understand the cat-burning festival of Ypres, we must step into a world where animals were seen not just as creatures but as vessels. In medieval Europe, cats were deeply associated with witchcraft and dark magic, believed to be familiars of witches and even embodiments of the devil himself. Yet this fear tangled with much older beliefs. Long before Christianity, the Norse goddess Freya, a deity of love and fertility, rode a chariot drawn by cats. When pagan traditions were suppressed, the church often demonized the old gods and their symbols. The cat, once sacred, became sinister. The people of Ypres, a major cloth trading center, faced a constant, invisible threat, rodent infestations that could ruin their precious wool stores and bring famine. They needed a powerful ritual to protect their livelihood, and they fused this practical terror with supernatural dread. The solution was a public, symbolic purge. Once a year during the city's fair, live cats were gathered, placed in sacks or baskets, and then thrown from the towering belfry in the main square. The act was meant to literally cast out the evil spirits they carried, destroying the vessels of witchcraft to ensure a bountiful harvest and prosperous trade. It was a grim transaction with the unseen world. The festival grew into a major spectacle. A grand procession would wind through the streets, led by a jester figure known as the Fool of Ypres, who embodied the carnivalesque spirit of turning the world upside down. He would mock the authorities and lead the crowd in song and revelry, building a tense, celebratory energy that culminated at the belfry. The throwing of the cats was the shocking climax, a communal catharsis met with cheers from the crowd below. This ritual persisted for centuries, a dark thread in the city's history, only finally being banned in the early 19th century as public sentiment toward animals began to change. But the memory did not fade. In a remarkable twist, modern Ypres now holds the Kattenstoat, or Cat Festival, every 3 years. It is a lavish, colorful parade with giant cat floats, people in historical costume, and musicians. The climax is no longer one of cruelty, but of symbolism, as plush toy cats are tossed from the same belfry for children to catch in the streets below. It is a community reclaiming its own bizarre history, transforming a ritual of fear into one of remembrance and, perhaps in its own way, an apology to the creatures once sacrificed to the darkness. That transformation from cruelty to pageantry shows how a ritual's meaning can change across centuries, but some rituals were never meant to be spectacles. In the quiet corners of rural Britain and Wales, a far more intimate and unsettling ceremony took place in the shadows of a deathbed. This was the practice of sin eating. When a person lay deceased, their family would place a piece of bread, sometimes sprinkled with salt, and a cup of ale or wine directly upon the chest of the corpse. They would then summon the village sin eater, a man or woman who lived on the absolute fringes of society. This outcast would enter the home, kneel by the body, and consume the food and drink. With each bite and sip, they were believed to be absorbing all the moral transgressions, the lies, the petty cruelties, the unconfessed sins of the departed. A short incantation was often spoken, something like, "I give thee rest and peace," or "I take upon me the sins of this person." For this service, the Sin Eater received a small coin, perhaps a few pence, and then was quickly shooed away, for their presence was considered deeply polluting. They carried the spiritual filth of the community, a walking repository of other people's guilt, which made them both essential and utterly reviled. They lived in isolation, often in a hut at the edge of the village, and were avoided at all costs in daily life. The foods used were not random. Bread represented the body, salt was an ancient preservative and purifier, and ale symbolized life. By consuming them from the corpse, the Sin Eater performed a grim, symbolic transference. This created a glaring theological contradiction. The formal Christian church offered confession, penance, and last rites to cleanse the soul. Yet here was a folk ritual that bypassed the priest entirely, placing the power of salvation in the hands of a social pariah and a piece of stale bread. It spoke to a deep, primal anxiety that the official channels might not be enough, that a soul could be trapped by forgotten misdeeds. The church, of course, fiercely opposed the practice, condemning it as pagan superstition and a direct challenge to its authority. As religious orthodoxy tightened its grip and communities became less isolated, the need for the Sin Eater faded. The last known practitioners vanished by the end of the 19th century, their strange, lonely office made obsolete not by law, but by a changing world that no longer believed in the tangible weight of a sin you could literally eat. The Sin Eater carried a community's guilt in lonely silence, but the next ritual we must confront was a spectacle of frantic, public agony. In the sweltering summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg witnessed a horror that seemed to defy the laws of nature and medicine. It began not with a ceremony, but with a single woman. A Frau Trophia stepped into the street one July day and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration. She simply danced, a jerking, relentless motion that she could not stop. She danced for hours, then days, until her feet were bloody and bruised. When she finally collapsed from exhaustion, she would rise again, compelled by an invisible force to continue. Within a week, dozens had joined her. Within a month, the streets were filled with over 400 people, all caught in the same uncontrollable, manic compulsion. They danced until their ribs cracked from the exertion. They danced until they succumbed to strokes or heart attacks. Historical records suggest as many as 15 people a day were dying from this relentless, involuntary performance. The town council was first baffled, then terrified. They consulted physicians who offered theories rooted in the medicine of the time. Some declared it a case of overheated blood, a physiological imbalance. Others saw the clear hand of divine punishment or demonic possession, a curse upon the city. In a desperate and catastrophically misguided attempt at a cure, the council decided the dancers must dance the fever out of their systems. They built a large wooden stage in the horse market, hired musicians with pipes and drums, and even brought in professional dancers to keep the afflicted moving. It was a public health measure that became a macabre festival. The council provided the beat for their own citizens' torture, believing they were helping purge the illness. Of course, it only made things worse. The constant music and enforced dancing exacerbated the mania, pulling more onlookers into the terrifying trance. Modern science looks back on this event with a different lens. The leading theory is mass psychogenic illness, a form of social contagion where extreme stress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through a population. Strasbourg at the time was crippled by famine, disease, and profound social unrest. The psychological pressure was immense, and this dancing plague may have been the body's catastrophic way of expressing what the mind could not bear. Another compelling theory points to ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on damp rye bread and contains chemicals similar to LSD, which can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and spasms that might look like a frenzied dance. Whether it was a poison in the bread or a fever in the mind, the people of Strasbourg were trapped in a ritual they never chose, a dance with death orchestrated by an invisible puppeteer of fear and desperation. The streets of Strasbourg echoed with a different kind of agony, a public torment inflicted by an unseen force. But in the cold halls of medieval justice, the ordeal was deliberate, a ritualized test where pain was the prosecutor and God the only judge. Among the most common and terrifying of these was the trial by boiling water. Imagine the scene in a quiet village churchyard. A large iron cauldron sits over a roaring fire, the water within bubbling violently. A local priest, his role twisted from spiritual guide to officiant of a cruel spectacle, would first perform a full liturgical ceremony. He would chant psalms, offer prayers, and bless the water itself, transforming the simple element into a holy medium, a direct conduit to divine judgment. The accused, perhaps a man suspected of theft or a woman whispered to be a poisoner, would stand before the community. Their fate rested not on evidence or witness testimony, but on a single, excruciating act. They had to reach into that seething cauldron, plunge their arm deep into the scalding water, and retrieve a small stone or ring from the bottom. The wound was immediately bandaged by the priest. For 3 agonizing days, the accused waited, their bandaged hand a ticking clock. When the wrappings were finally removed, a priest would inspect the injury. If the burn had festered, if pus and infection bloomed, it was a clear sign of God's condemnation, and the punishment was severe, often mutilation or death. But if the wound was healing cleanly, it was a miraculous declaration of innocence. The psychological pressure was its own form of torture. To refuse the ordeal was an admission of guilt. To undergo it was to face almost certain horrific injury. The ritual placed the burden of proof directly on the body of the accused, leveraging their own fear and faith against them. It was used primarily for those of lower social standing, for serfs and commoners where sworn oaths from honorable men were not available. The Church's participation lent it a terrifying legitimacy, making divine will seem brutally tangible. Yet this very brutality sowed the seeds of the practice's demise. By the early 13th century, many within the Church grew deeply uneasy with these violent spectacles. They questioned whether humans could truly compel God to perform a miracle on demand. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, a monumental gathering of church leaders, issued a decisive decree. It forbade priests from participating in or blessing any trial by ordeal. Without the Church's sacred framework, the ritual lost its power. The boiling water grew cold, not because people stopped believing in justice, but because the authorities finally decided that God's will should not be sought in the blistering of human skin. But if the ordeal by water sought divine truth through pain, another ritual found its power in pure, chaotic laughter. The Feast of Fools was a temporary revolution, a day when the solemn stone cathedrals of Europe echoed not with hymns but with raucous parody. This was not a fringe event. For centuries, around the 1st of January, churches across France, England, and beyond would transform. Lower-ranking clergy, the subdeacons and choir boys, would seize control. They would elect one of their own as the Bishop of Fools or the Lord of Misrule, dress him in ludicrous vestments, and lead him in a mocking procession through the streets. Inside the sanctuary, the sacred Mass was turned on its head. Priests wore masks or dressed as women. They would chant the liturgy backward, bray like donkeys instead of saying Amen, and swing smoking censers filled not with frankincense but with the pungent smell of burning old shoes. Obscene songs replaced psalms, and dice were sometimes rolled right on the altar. The roots of this madness stretched back to the ancient Roman Saturnalia. A December festival where masters served their slaves and social order was deliberately upended. The medieval church, unable to stamp out this deep-seated human desire for temporary inversion, absorbed and Christianized it, tying it to the feast of the circumcision or the Epiphany. On the surface, it was simply wild fun, a pressure valve for a society rigidly stratified by class and doctrine. For one day, the poor could mock the rich, the young could ridicule the old, and everyone could laugh at the very authorities that ruled their lives. It served a vital psychological function, releasing pent-up tensions that might otherwise boil over into real rebellion, but the Church Fathers watched with growing alarm. To them, this was not harmless release, it was sacrilege of the highest order. The mockery was too accurate, the laughter too pointed. It risked making a genuine joke of the divine mysteries themselves. By the 15th century, the outcry was deafening. Theological faculties and bishops issued condemnation after condemnation. One furious letter from the Paris faculty in 1445 described the feast as a disgusting spectacle where actors impersonate bishops and archbishops and make jokes and commit foul acts. They saw it not as a safety valve, but as a crack in the very foundation of their authority. Despite repeated and strenuous bans, the Feast of Fools proved incredibly resilient, popping up again in towns for decades after each official prohibition. Its eventual fade was less about enforcement and more about the slow, cultural shift of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, which demanded a new, more severe kind of piety. The laughter in the cathedral finally died down, not by decree, but because the world outside its walls had changed. The cathedral's fading laughter gave way to a far more terrifying sound, the sudden, shattering crack of a thunderstorm. For medieval communities, a lightning strike was not a random natural event. It was a direct attack, a thunderbolt hurled by an angry god or a demon tearing through the sky. Their response was a ritual of desperate defense, the blessing of the thunderbolt. In countless villages across Europe, the first line of protection was not prayer alone, but a physical object, a thunderstone. These were not ordinary rocks. They were often Neolithic stone axe heads or oddly shaped fossils, flint tools and belemnites lost by ancient peoples and unearthed by farmers plowing their fields. Their peculiar, worked shapes convinced people they could not be of this earth. The logic was simple and powerful. Since these stones were found in the ground after violent storms, they must have fallen from the very clouds that produced the thunder and lightning. They were seen as the physical remnants of the celestial weapon itself. To harness their power, families would carefully embed a thunderstone into the foundation of a new home or barn, or place one on the central roof beam. It was a form of sympathetic magic, the belief that a piece of the storm, now anchored within the home, would divert future strikes. The stone acted as a lightning rod of the spirit world, its presence saying, "This house is already full of your power, move along." This practice was pure pagan animism, treating an object as a living repository of supernatural force. Yet the Church, unable to eradicate such a deep-seated belief, often worked to baptize it. A priest might be called to bless the thunderstone, sprinkling it with holy water and praying over it, effectively recruiting the pagan relic into the army of Christian protection. The ritual became a seamless, unspoken blend of two worldviews, but when the storm clouds gathered and the first distant rumble echoed, a more public and sonorous ritual began, the violent ringing of the church bells. This was not the gentle call to Mass, this was a frantic, clamorous alarm. Bell ringers, often the bravest or most devout men in the parish, would race to the belfry as the sky darkened. They believed the consecrated bronze of the bells, inscribed with holy texts and symbols, held immense power. By swinging them with all their might, the sacred sound waves would physically clash with the demonic forces in the clouds, shattering their formation and driving them away. The louder and more chaotic the pealing, the better. It was a sonic exorcism of the heavens. Church authorities actually encouraged this for centuries, publishing official manuals with prayers to be recited while storm ringing. The tragic irony, of course, was that this ritual of protection was lethally dangerous. Tall church towers were the highest points in any village, and the bell ropes, often wet, provided a perfect conduit for lightning. Hundreds of bell ringers across Europe were killed at their posts, struck down while trying to ward off the very force that claimed them. Their deaths were often seen not as a failure of the ritual, but as a testament to the ferocity of the demonic attack they had bravely faced. It was a perfect, heartbreaking loop of faith and fear, where the tool of salvation became an instrument of martyrdom, all in a desperate attempt to argue with the weather. The desperate ringing of church bells was a plea to the heavens, but some rituals were built on a far darker kind of offering. The image of a giant wicker statue, its hollow limbs packed with living men and animals, set ablaze against the night sky, is one of the most enduring and chilling symbols of ancient barbarity. This is the specter of the Wicker Man. While our popular understanding comes largely from a 1970s film, the concept was first recorded by Julius Caesar in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars. He described the Gauls constructing enormous human-shaped cages from woven wood, filling them with victims and setting them on fire as a sacrifice to their gods, an offering meant to ensure fertility and victory. For Caesar, this was a powerful piece of propaganda, a shocking illustration of the savage otherness of the tribes Rome was conquering, a justification for bringing civilization to the barbarians. Centuries later, medieval Christian monks and chroniclers, copying and recopying ancient texts like Caesar's, seized upon this image with horrified fascination. It became the ultimate symbol of pagan depravity in their historical imaginations. When they wrote about the pre-Christian past of their own lands, Britain, Ireland, or Scandinavia, the Wicker Man served as a ready-made illustration of the darkness from which their faith had saved them. It was a convenient and terrifying shorthand. The ritual itself was almost certainly exaggerated by Caesar and then mythologized by medieval writers. There is no solid archaeological evidence for such large-scale sacrificial burnings in early medieval Europe. What evidence we do have points to more mundane, though still grim, practices, like the occasional sacrifice of animals, weapons, or even humans in bogs or wells as offerings to the gods. But the Wicker Man was never really about historical fact for medieval people. It was about a story, a moral lesson. It served as a potent tool for demonizing not only the past, but also contemporary outsider groups. Heretics, witches, or even neighboring pagan tribes could be rhetorically linked to this ultimate atrocity. By invoking the Wicker Man, a chronicler was saying, "This is what happens without the light of the church. This is the true face of the unbeliever." It created a stark divide between the civilized Christian self and the monstrous pagan other. The power of the idea lay in its visceral horror, the fusion of imprisonment, helplessness, and a very public apocalyptic fire. It was a nightmare made manifest, a story so potent it outlived the reality it supposedly described, burning its way through centuries of folklore to remind the medieval mind of a salvation that always felt fragile, and a past that was perpetually smoldering just beneath the surface of their faith. While the Wicker Man was a terrifying story from the pagan past, another inversion of power was a cherished and sanctioned tradition within the very walls of the church. Each year on the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the day commemorating King Herod's slaughtered children, a strange and wonderful transfer of authority took place. In cathedrals, monasteries, and choir schools from England to Spain, the solemn hierarchy of the church was turned delightfully upside down with the election of the boy bishop. The selection was often a grand affair. In some places, the choir boys would hold a mock election, complete with speeches and voting. In others, the honor would rotate or fall to the boy who sang the first line of a particular hymn during the Mass. Once chosen, the child was robed in exquisite miniature versions of a real bishop's vestments, complete with a tiny mitre and a pastoral staff. For the next 24 hours, his authority was absolute. The boy bishop would lead processions through the streets with the real clergy, and often the actual bishop himself following humbly behind. He would preside over portions of the church services, deliver a sermon typically written for him by a teacher, and even bestow blessings upon the crowds who flocked to see the spectacle. People would kneel to receive his blessing, treating the charade with a mix of genuine reverence and amused celebration. The boy enjoyed specific, thrilling privileges. He could demand treats from the townsfolk, and a lavish feast was held in his honor where the normal rules of decorum were relaxed. In some records, the boy bishop and his fellow choir boys were even allowed to collect donations during their processions, keeping a share for their school. This was not mere childish play. The ritual served a profound social purpose. By letting the lowest in the church's rigid order the children temporarily become the highest, it taught everyone about the structure of authority by letting them experience its opposite. It demonstrated that the roles of bishop, priest, and deacon were offices, not the men themselves, and that all earthly power was ultimately temporary. For one day, the meek truly did inherit the cathedral. The laughter was instructive, not subversive, but as religious winds shifted, the tone of that laughter began to sound different to reforming ears. During the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, a new, more severe piety took hold. Ceremonies seen as frivolous or too closely tied to medieval folk tradition came under intense scrutiny. The boy bishop, with his playful parody and festive feasting, was condemned as an undignified mockery of sacred office. In England, King Henry VIII officially abolished the practice in 1541, calling it a childish vanity. Across Europe, similar bans followed. The sanctioned world turned upside down was forcibly set right again, not because it failed to teach its lesson, but because a new, sterner age believed that holiness and hierarchy should never, ever be a game. The solemn authority of the boy bishop gave way to a far more earthy and boisterous kind of ceremony, one that smelled of frost, soil, and the promise of spring. Plough Monday marked the official end of the Christmas holidays and the grim return to work for the farm labourers of England. But before the first furrow was cut in the frozen earth, the ploughmen seized one last chance for revelry and reward. They would decorate their most essential tool, the heavy wooden plough, with ribbons, painted patterns, and bells. A team of men, often led by a character called the Bessie, a man dressed in women's clothes with a blackened face, would drag this festive plough from farm to farm and door to door in the village. They were not begging, they were performing a ritual of immense importance, demanding payment for the blessing they brought. The group would chant specific rhymes, their words a blend of threat and promise. One traditional verse went, "God speed the plough and send the master a good crop. Remember the poor ploughboys who follow the plough." They offered to bless the land and the household for the coming year, ensuring fertility and good fortune. In return, they expected money, food, or drink. This was a transaction with the unseen forces of the earth itself, and refusal was considered deeply foolish. If a household was stingy or turned them away empty-handed, the ploughmen had a potent retaliation. They would not argue. Instead, they would use their decorated plough to rip up a symbolic strip of the homeowner's front garden or even the dirt before their doorstep, a public curse meant to blight their land and invite poverty. The message was clear: you refused our blessing, so now you receive its opposite. Accompanying the plough were the Molly dancers, a troupe of men with soot-blackened faces and ragged, colorful costumes who performed a heavy, stomping dance. Their black faces were a disguise, yes, allowing them a degree of anonymity for their cheeky demands, but it also connected them to the fertile, dark soil they were about to turn. The Bessie, with his feminine attire, likely represented a surviving echo of a pre-Christian Earth Mother or fertility goddess, a spirit of the land who needed to be appeased and awakened after the winter sleep. On the surface, this was a rowdy bit of folk tradition, yet it served multiple crucial functions in a tightly knit agricultural community. It was a vital form of seasonal charity, collecting resources for the poorest laborers during the leanest time of year, disguised as a performance fee. It ritually prepared the tools and the men for the hard work ahead, marking the transition from festival to toil. And most profoundly, it was a last, loud attempt to magically influence the coming growing season, to wake the sleeping earth and negotiate with the old powers for a bountiful harvest. The Church tolerated it, as it often did with such deeply rooted customs, seeing it as a harmless, if peculiar, way to mark the calendar. But the heart of Plough Monday beat with a rhythm far older than any sermon, a stubborn, muddy pulse of threat, hope, and community survival etched not in prayer books but in the very furrows of the land. The muddy pulse of Plough Monday was a negotiation with the earth, but the turning of the seasons demanded a grander, more dramatic story. Across the frost-locked villages of Britain, another ancient tale was acted out with fists and foliage, the ritual combat of the Oak King and the Holly King. This was no simple folk tale, it was a living myth performed in village squares, a cosmic battle made flesh. The characters were elemental. The Oak King, crowned with a great circlet of green oak leaves and acorns, embodied the burgeoning power of summer, the sun at its zenith, life in full, expansive bloom. His rival, the Holly King, was clad in the dark, prickly leaves and bright red berries of the holly tree, representing the deep, introspective power of winter, the retreating sun, and the sleeping earth. Their conflict was eternal, a cycle written into the very fabric of the year. The ritual was timed with celestial precision. At the winter solstice, the longest night, the two would meet in a scripted, symbolic duel. Though the Holly King currently held sway, the Oak King would triumph in this midwinter fight, symbolically killing his rival and taking the throne. This represented the sun's promised return, the moment the days begin to grow longer again. Then, 6 months later at the summer solstice, the battle was re-fought with the opposite outcome. The triumphant Oak King, at the peak of his strength, would be defeated by the resurgent Holly King, marking the sun's turn toward decline and the coming harvest. The fight itself was a loud, boisterous spectacle. The two kings would circle each other, reciting traditional verses about light and dark, growth and decay, before clashing with wooden swords or staves. Their combat was choreographed, a dramatic dance ending with one falling dead upon the ground, only to be revived by a comic doctor character who would pronounce the corpse cured with a slap or a swig from a bottle. This death and resurrection was not tragic, it was necessary, the engine of the world itself. For an agricultural society, this ritual provided a vital, reassuring narrative. The anxiety of the deepening dark or the fading light was given a plot, a hero, and a guaranteed happy ending, or rather, a guaranteed new beginning. It transformed the impersonal mechanics of the solar cycle into a personal drama of kingship and succession, something villagers could witness and participate in. As Christianity spread, this potent pagan drama was too powerful to erase, so it was absorbed. The characters of the Oak and Holly Kings found new life within the mummers' plays performed at Christmas time. Troops of villagers, disguised with masks and ribbons, would travel from house to house, performing a medley of scenes that now included St. George fighting a dragon, but often kept the essential duel of the Green Man and a rival, a clear echo of the old seasonal kings. The ritual combat became folk entertainment, its deepest meaning softening but never quite disappearing, a reminder that every Christmas celebration sits upon a much older story of a light that is always reborn in the deepest dark. The eternal duel of the Oak and Holly Kings was a battle for the seasons themselves, but medieval communities faced far more immediate and ravenous enemies. When a cloud of locusts descended or a creeping army of caterpillars devoured an entire harvest, the response was not merely prayer, it was a full legal prosecution. In an age utterly defenseless against insect plagues, people turned to the only supreme authority they knew, the court of the church. One of the most meticulously recorded cases comes from the year 1120 in the Diocese of Lyon, France. The farmers there watched in horror as their fields were being systematically consumed by a relentless infestation of caterpillars, likely the larvae of the cabbage-white butterfly. With no chemical pesticides and their livelihoods vanishing bite by tiny bite, they did what any desperate community might do. They hired a lawyer and brought suit against the insects. The proceedings were conducted with all the solemn gravity of a human trial. A formal summons was issued in the name of the church, commanding the caterpillars to appear before the ecclesiastical court on a specified date to answer for the crimes of trespass and destruction of property. This document was not merely recited, it was physically served. A court officer would journey to the afflicted fields and nail the summons to a post or a tree, a public notification to the defendants that they were now subjects of holy law. When the pests, unsurprisingly, failed to present themselves in court, they were tried in absentia. A priest, acting as both judge and prosecutor, would argue the case against them, detailing the devastation they had wrought upon the God-given bounty meant for Christian souls. A defense lawyer was sometimes even appointed for the insects, arguing perhaps that they too were God's creatures with a right to sustenance, a fascinating early glimmer of ecological debate. The verdict was almost always guilty. The sentence was excommunication or anathema. In a powerful public ceremony, the priest would pronounce a formal curse, expelling the caterpillars from the community of the faithful and condemning them to leave the diocese forever. The ritual weaponized the Church's ultimate spiritual sanction, the cutting off of a soul from divine grace, and aimed it at a swarm of mindless insects. The logic was breathtakingly literal. If God commanded all of creation and the Church was his voice on earth, then its decrees must bind every living thing, even pests. This was not seen as superstition, but as a logical application of divine order. The failure of the caterpillars to comply was not a refutation of the power of the curse, but rather proof of their demonic inspiration, their alignment with the forces of chaos against God's harmony. While to modern eyes it seems a futile, even comical spectacle, it served a profound psychological purpose for a terrified populace. It transformed a helpless panic into structured, communal action. It reaffirmed their worldview, placing even inexplicable natural disasters within the framework of faith and law. And in some rare, fortunate cases where the infestation naturally subsided, it provided miraculous confirmation that the system worked. The cursed caterpillars of Leon remind us that in the face of nature's blind appetite, the medieval mind would rather wage a war of words in a holy court than admit there was no court that could possibly hear their case. While legal curses were hurled at insects, other believers sought a far more visceral proof of divine favor, one that left its mark not on a court document but on the soles of their feet. In the villages of Thrace and Macedonia, a ritual of astonishing physical endurance defied the very laws of nature. The Anastenaria, a fire-walking ceremony honoring Saints Constantine and Helen, transforms faith into a literal trial by fire. Its origins are shrouded in the ancient past, likely stretching back to Dionysian rites for the god of ecstasy and wine, but by the medieval period it was firmly cloaked in Christian veneration. The entire community prepares for months. Central to the ritual are specific, revered icons of the two saints, believed to hold miraculous power. These are not merely paintings, they are treated as living presences, cared for, spoken to, and dressed in elaborate silver coverings. When the festival date arrives, the atmosphere crackles with anticipation. The ritual begins not with fire, but with rhythm. Musicians play a relentless, hypnotic melody on the lyra, a three-stringed fiddle, and the diaiolai, a large drum. To this pulsating soundtrack, the firewalkers, known as the Anastenarides, begin to dance. They move in a specific, shuffling step, holding the sacred icons aloft, their eyes fixed and distant. This is not performance, it is a methodical journey into an altered state. Through hours of rhythmic dancing, chanting, and focused veneration, they enter a profound trance. Their breathing deepens, their awareness of the outside world dims, and a powerful sense of dissociation takes hold. They are preparing to meet the fire not as ordinary men and women, but as vessels of the saint's grace. Meanwhile, a massive bonfire of oak logs has been burning for hours in the village square. As night falls, the flames are pushed aside, leaving a broad, deep bed of glowing red embers, radiating an intense heat that forces onlookers to step back. The music reaches a fever pitch. The lead firewalker, still clutching the icon, steps onto the coals. He does not run, he walks with a steady, deliberate pace, his bare feet sinking into the searing embers. Others follow, sometimes carrying their own icons, sometimes dancing lightly across the bed of fire. They may remain on the coals for 20, 30, or even more seconds. When they step off, their feet are inspected by the crowd. Miraculously, they are unburned, perhaps lightly dusted with ash but showing no blisters or wounds. The scientific explanations offered today are as fascinating as the faith that drives the ritual. The psychological theory of dissociation suggests the trance state so alters pain perception and focus that walkers do not react to the heat in a normal way, preventing the panic that could lead to missteps and injury. A more physical explanation points to the Leidenfrost effect, where a thin layer of moisture on the skin, perhaps from sweat, vaporizes upon brief contact with extreme heat, creating a protective, insulating barrier for a second or two. Yet neither science nor faith fully explains the sustained, slow walk across a deep bed of coals. For the practitioners, there is no mystery, only miracle. The fire is a test and a purification, a direct communion with the protective power of the saints. The medieval church viewed such dramatic displays with deep suspicion, seeing them as dangerous pagan holdovers disguised in Christian garb. It issued decrees against the practice, attempting to suppress it, but the anastenaria proved too powerful, too embedded in the identity of these communities. Eventually, a strained tolerance emerged, an unspoken agreement to let the ritual continue so long as it officially honored Christian saints. This firewalking endures to this day, a breathtaking paradox where medieval mysticism meets timeless human longing, a search for proof so tangible you can walk across it. The blazing faith of the firewalker sought communion through heat, but in the frosty orchards of medieval England, a gentler, yet no less earnest, ritual aimed to awaken life with song and cider. Wassailing the apple trees was a midwinter plea disguised as a rowdy party, a direct negotiation with the sleeping spirits of the orchard to guarantee the autumn's most crucial crop. For these communities, apples were not merely fruit, they were the foundation of cider, the daily drink that provided vital calories and safe hydration in a world of uncertain water. The orchard's health was a matter of communal survival. The ritual always took place on Twelfth Night, January 5th, the eve of Epiphany, a time deeply associated with magic and revelation. As dusk fell, a procession would form, led by the farmer and the wassail king and queen, often the oldest or most respected villagers. They carried with them a large, decorated bowl of specially prepared hot cider, the wassail itself spiced with nutmeg, ginger, and cloves, and laden with floating pieces of toast. The group would gather around the oldest and most productive tree in the orchard, the apple tree man, believed to be the guardian spirit of the entire grove. The ceremony began with a reverent silence. Then, one person, often a child for their perceived purity, would carefully pour a libation of cider onto the roots of the tree, feeding the spirit within the cold earth. A traditional rhyme would be sung directly to the branches, a potent mix of blessing, demand, and threat. One of the most famous verses goes, "Here's to thee, old apple tree, whence thou mayst bud, and whence thou mayst blow, and whence thou mayst bear apples eno. Hats full, caps full, bushel, bushel, sacks full, and my pockets full too." The song was an incantation, a verbal map of the desired future. Following the song came the noise. The villagers would shout, bang pots and pans, blow horns, and even fire shotguns into the air. This cacophony had a dual purpose: to rudely awaken the tree spirit from its winter slumber, and to frighten away any malignant spirits that might be lurking in the bare branches, waiting to blight the coming buds. Then came the offering. Pieces of toast from the wassail bowl, soaked in the spiced cider, were carefully wedged into the forks of the branches. This was not for the tree, but for the robins. These birds were seen as the benevolent guardian spirits of the orchard, and the toast was a gift to secure their protection for the coming year. With the ritual complete, the solemnity vanished. The wassail bowl was passed around, and everyone drank deeply, toasting the tree, each other, and the future harvest. The celebration often spilled into the farmhouse, where the farmer was expected to provide more food and drink for the wassailers. Refusal was considered terribly bad luck, an insult to the community and the spirits they had just petitioned. This ritual is a perfect snapshot of medieval animism, the belief that a conscious spirit resided within the ancient apple tree, a being that could be nourished, awakened, praised, and bargained with. It was agriculture as a relationship, a yearly contract renewed with song, noise, and a shared drink, ensuring that the silent, sleeping trees would remember their part of the bargain when spring finally arrived. The spirit of the apple tree was nourished with cider and song, but other creatures were sought not for their life but for their death and the strange power it was believed to release. In the shadowy world of medieval folk magic, few animals were as surrounded by dark superstition as the common toad. Its warty skin, its nocturnal habits, and its seeming ability to appear from damp, dark places made it a creature of profound mystery. It was not merely an amphibian, it was a walking apothecary, a living vessel of potent and dangerous magic. This belief spawned one of the grisliest lost rituals, the creation and use of the sacred toad amulet. The process was methodical and chilling. A practitioner, often a cunning man or wise woman, would first capture a specific toad, sometimes seeking one found in a particular place, like a churchyard or a crossroads, which were liminal spaces charged with spiritual energy. The creature was then killed, not with a simple blow, but through a ritualized form of sympathetic magic. One common method involved piercing the toad with thorns from the hawthorn tree, a plant itself steeped in fairy lore and protection magic. The body was then carefully dried, sometimes in the heat of the sun, other times in the smoke of a particular herb like vervain or mugwort. The resulting desiccated carcass, often reduced to a skeletal, leathery lump, was the core of the amulet. It might be placed in a small bag with other magical ingredients, herbs, stones, or written charms, and then carried on the person. This was not a trophy, it was a battery. The toad was believed to absorb malignant forces, acting as a spiritual lightning rod to draw curses, the evil eye, or illness away from the bearer. It was a charm of protection born from a calculated act of destruction. But the rituals grew more extreme. Some traditions spoke of the toad bone ritual, a complex and eerie ceremony to obtain a single, powerful bone. After the toad was killed, its body would be placed in an anthill, allowing the insects to meticulously clean the skeleton. The practitioner would then return at midnight, often under a full moon, to retrieve the bones. They would cast them into a running stream, and the one bone that floated upstream against the current was the sacred one. This bone was said to grant its owner powers of invisibility, control over animals, or even influence over the wills of other people. Other recipes involved brewing toad potions, where parts of the animal were steeped in wine or ale to create a concoction meant to cure ailments or, more darkly, to poison an enemy under the guise of a love philtre. The line between folk medicine and diabolical witchcraft in the eyes of the church was obliterated here. In medieval trial records for witchcraft, the possession of a dried toad or the knowledge of such preparations was frequently cited as damning evidence. It proved a pact with unclean forces, a willingness to manipulate creation for personal power. The toad's association with poison in its skin made it a natural symbol for malice and hidden harm. When a suspicious death occurred and a dried toad was found among a suspect's belongings, it was not seen as a simple amulet, it was a murder weapon consecrated by hell. This ritual shows the terrifying flip side of the medieval worldview. If every creature held a spark of divine purpose, then that purpose could be hijacked, its essence twisted through ritual into a tool. The humble toad, in its transition from living creature to dried talisman, embodied the ultimate alchemy, where faith in the unseen world curdled into a desperate and often condemned attempt to command it. The toad bone's dark magic sought to command fate, but in the sunlit alpine meadows of Switzerland, fate was a game played with a wheel of cheese. Among the most delightfully peculiar lost rituals is the practice of cheese rolling for divination, where an entire community's future was read in the bouncing, unpredictable path of a dairy product. On specific feast days, often around the spring equinox or local saints' days, villagers would gather on a chosen hillside. These were not just any slopes, they were ritually significant places like the Kesruten near the town of Zug, or other carefully selected pastures with a clear, long run. The cheese itself was the star, a massive, heavy wheel of emmental or similar hard cheese, sometimes weighing as much as a small child. This was no casual snack. It was a condensed symbol of the community's labor and wealth, a product of the cows, the grass, and the careful aging process. To set it rolling was to send a piece of their collective soul careening toward destiny. The ceremony was tense with anticipation. A designated elder, or sometimes the head of a young person's household, would stand at the hill's crest holding the great wheel. With a heave, they would send it tumbling down the grassy incline. The entire village watched, breath held, as the cheese began its chaotic journey. Its path was the text of the oracle. Did it roll straight and true, maintaining a steady course to the bottom? This was an excellent omen, predicting a year of smooth progress, good health, and straightforward success. If it wobbled erratically, veering left and right, it foretold a year of uncertainties and difficult decisions ahead. A sudden, dramatic crash into a rock or tree was a dire warning of impending conflict or a bad harvest. But the most intense scrutiny was reserved for matters of the heart. Young men and women would watch with particular hope or dread. If the cheese wheel came to rest pointing toward a specific village or farmstead, it was seen as a clear sign of where one's future spouse would come from. A final spin as it settled could indicate the direction a loved one would travel or the success of a proposed marriage. After the cheese reached its conclusion, it was quickly retrieved. The ritual then transformed into a feast. The very same wheel, now imbued with prophetic power, was carefully broken open and shared among all present. By consuming the cheese, the villagers were literally ingesting the fortune it had just revealed, internalizing the prophecy and binding themselves to its outcome. This ritual perfectly encapsulates the medieval blend of practicality and mysticism. It took an object of immense daily importance, cheese, a staple of survival in the high Alps, and made it a messenger to the divine. The logic was beautifully simple. If God or fate guides the fall of a sparrow, then surely it can guide the roll of a cheese. The randomness of the event was not seen as chance, but as a coded message, a physical manifestation of a plan too vast for human minds to comprehend directly. It was a way to make the abstract tangible, to see the invisible hand of destiny at work in the joyful, communal spectacle of a dairy wheel bouncing down a hill in the bright spring sun. The prophetic cheese wheel settled its fate, but in the sun-baked markets of colonial Oaxaca, another humble root vegetable became the centerpiece of a luminous, fleeting art. On the evening of December 23rd, the entire city would gather not for a solemn mass, but for a spectacular exhibition of the bizarre and beautiful, the Night of the Radishes. This tradition began with a clever, practical trick. Spanish monks introduced the large, daikon-like radish to Mexico in the 18th century, and local farmers found they grew to astonishing sizes in the Oaxacan soil. To attract last-minute shoppers for the Christmas market on the 23rd, vendors began carving small nicks and shapes into the radishes to make them more visually appealing. But what started as a simple sales tactic soon blossomed into an artistic arms race. Farmers, possessing a deep, inherent knowledge of the land and its fruits, began to see the potential in the radish's dense white flesh and vibrant red skin. They started carving not just simple patterns, but entire biblical tableaus, intricate nativity scenes with shepherds, angels, and the Holy Family, all rendered in startling detail from a single massive root. The radishes used were not the small salad variety. They could be over 20 inches long and weigh several pounds, their twisted, gnarled forms suggesting pre-existing shapes that the artist's knife would merely reveal. The carvers, often entire families passing down techniques for generations, would work for days in secret, using only simple tools like knives, pins, and sometimes small chisels. They would sculpt breathtakingly delicate scenes. A radish might become a miniature cathedral with rose windows cut so thin they were translucent. Another would be transformed into the Virgin of Guadalupe, her cloak suggested by the natural red skin of the radish, her face carefully etched into the white interior. Local legends and folk tales also came to life, with figures like the revolutionary hero Benito Juarez or mythical creatures emerging from the vegetable's core. By the evening of the 23rd, the main plaza, the Zocalo, was transformed. Hundreds of carved radishes were displayed on beds of moss under the glow of lanterns and later electric lights. The air, thick with the spicy, peppery scent of freshly cut radish, mixed with the sounds of marimba music and the murmurs of an amazed crowd. Families moved from display to display, pointing out the incredible craftsmanship, the way a carver had used a root's forked tail to create a dragon's split tongue, or how the subtle gradient from red skin to white heart perfectly depicted a sunset over a biblical town. The festival was so popular that by the late 19th century, the city council formalized it, creating official competitions with prizes for the most impressive carvings. This was the moment it solidified from a market custom into a true communal ritual. The act of carving became a devotional practice, a way to physically meditate on the Christmas story through the material of the earth. The ephemeral nature of the art, a radish wilting and shrinking within mere hours of being cut, made it profoundly poignant. Like a sand mandala, its beauty was in its impermanence, a reminder that the sacred story it depicted was eternal, even if its vegetable vessel was not. This ritual, born from a farmer's simple need to sell his crop, became an annual testament to the human desire to find the extraordinary hidden within the most ordinary of things, to carve faith, story, and community identity from the very soil they tended. The luminous radish carvings celebrated creation, but in the face of the Black Death's unimaginable horror, another ritual sought salvation through self-destruction. As the plague swept across Europe in the 1340s, wiping out entire families in days, the established prayers and processions of the church seemed to offer no protection. From this abyss of despair arose a terrifying new movement, the flagellants. They believed the plague was not a natural disaster, but the literal wrath of a furious God, punishing humanity for its collective sin. Their solution was radical, public, and bloody, to atone for all of humanity by inflicting the punishment upon themselves. They organized into disciplined bands, sometimes hundreds strong, and marched from city to city in a grim pilgrimage. Their uniform was a haunting sight, a plain white robe marked with a large red cross on the front and back, symbolizing both their penitence and their claim to a Christ-like sacrifice. They followed a strict 33-day cycle of penance, mirroring the years of Christ's life, governed by a detailed rule book that dictated every action. Upon entering a town, they would proceed to the church square in a solemn, silent column. Forming a circle, they would remove their robes to the waist, lay face down on the ground in the shape of a cross, and begin their liturgy. A leader would chant a mournful hymn, a plea for mercy, and with each verse the men would rise, take up their scourges, and whip themselves in a brutal, rhythmic cadence. The scourge was a multi-tailed whip, its leather straps often tipped with sharpened iron knots or hooks designed to tear the flesh. With each swing over the shoulder onto their bare backs, the flagellants would cry out, "Lord, have mercy." The spectacle was both mesmerizing and horrifying. the air filled with the sound of chanting, the whistle of the lashes, and the wet thud of impact. Blood would soon fly, spattering their white robes with crimson and staining the ground. They would whip themselves until their backs were a shredded, pulpy mess, many collapsing from pain and exhaustion, only to rise and continue when the chant demanded it. Onlookers watched in a complex mix of terror, pity, and awe. Many townspeople saw them as living saints, the only ones brave enough to confront divine anger head-on. They would rush forward to collect the fallen drops of blood on scraps of cloth, believing them to be holy relics with the power to ward off the plague. For a time, the Church tolerated this extreme display, seeing it as an outpouring of pious fervor in a time of universal crisis. But the movement's theology soon grew dangerously independent. Flagellants began to claim their bloody ritual granted not just God's favor, but actual forgiveness of sins, a direct challenge to the Church's monopoly on sacramental absolution. Some leaders declared that their blood mixed with Christ's held more power than the blood of the Eucharist. This was heresy of the highest order. When the flagellants started attracting vast followings and preaching against the clergy themselves, the Church's patience shattered. In 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a bull condemning them as a fanatical sect and ordering their immediate suppression. Secular authorities, who also feared the destabilizing mobs, complied with brutal force. Flagellant leaders were arrested and burned at the stake, their bands were violently dispersed, and the public rituals were banned on pain of death. The movement was driven underground, its desperate, bloody spectacle fading from the public squares, a testament to the terrifying lengths people will go to find meaning when the world is literally dying around them. While the flagellants sought purification through their own blood, another plague demanded a different kind of elemental cleansing. When a murrain, a devastating cattle plague, swept through a medieval village, the threat was existential. The loss of a herd meant starvation, poverty, and the collapse of the community. In this moment of profound vulnerability, people turned not to the Church, but to a ritual of fire so ancient it seemed to speak to the world's first dawn. This was the need fire. The first and most crucial step was an act of profound communal darkness. Every single hearth fire in the village had to be completely extinguished. Not a single ember could glow in a fireplace, not a single candle could remain lit. This total blackout symbolized a clean slate, a rejection of the tainted, corrupted fire that had presided over the sickness. It was a collective act of humility and hope, plunging the entire community into a symbolic void from which only a miracle could rescue them. From that void, they would create a miracle of their own. The new fire could not be struck from flint and steel, for iron was considered a corrupting, human-made element. Instead, they returned to the most primal method known to humanity, friction. Two men, often chosen for their virtue or strength, would take two pieces of dry oak wood. One piece, the hearthboard, was placed flat on the ground with a small notch cut into its edge. The other, the spindle, was a straight rod. The spindle was set upright in the notch, and the men would take turns or use a bow-like device to rotate it with immense speed and pressure. This was back-breaking, meticulous work. They would spin and press until the friction generated a fine, black powder of charred wood dust in the notch. As they pushed harder and faster, this powder would begin to smolder, glowing with a tiny, intense ember. With the gentlest breath, they would coax this infant ember onto a waiting bundle of perfectly dry tinder, often made of birch bark or dried fungus, and blow it into the world's newest, purest flame. This was the need fire, also called wildfire or living fire. It was fire untouched by any previous human use, born not from a tool, but from the very friction of the world's own materials. Its purity was its power. From this single, sacred source, runners with torches would relight every hearth in the village, binding the community back together with a shared, sanctified element. But the ritual's climax was for the cattle themselves. The need fire was used to build two large bonfires or a single fire with a narrow channel between them. As the flames died down to create a thick, cleansing smoke, the entire herd was driven, lowing and nervous, directly through the smoke or over the embers. The belief was absolute. The elemental purity of this virgin fire could burn away the invisible miasma of disease, disinfecting the animals in a spiritual and physical baptism of smoke and heat. For a people who understood disease as a kind of spiritual pollution, this made perfect sense. They were not just treating sick animals, they were performing an exorcism on their entire livelihood, using the one element that could scourge corruption from the world. The need fire was a ritual of absolute renewal, a defiant act of starting over from the very spark of creation itself. The primal purity of the need fire sought to cleanse the living, but what of those who had already crossed the threshold? In the remote villages of the Alps and the vast forests of Eastern Europe, a funeral rite turned the quiet grief of a Christian burial into something far more confrontational. Here, mourners did not simply bid a peaceful farewell. They would gather around the body and unleash a torrent of abuse. They might shout accusations at the silent corpse, listing its faults and misdeeds, a final public airing of grievances. In some Slavic traditions, they would even strike the coffin with sticks or their hands, a physical punctuation to their scolding. The most extreme versions involved manipulating the body itself, turning it face down in the coffin or binding its limbs, all to prevent it from rising. This ritualized mockery of the corpse was not born from disrespect, but from a profound and paralyzing terror, the fear of the restless dead. For these communities, death was not a clean transition to heaven or hell. It was a dangerous liminal state where a spirit, especially one with unfinished business, a sudden death, or a particularly spiteful personality, could cling to the world of the living as a malevolent ghost, a vampire, or a plague-bearing wraith. The psychological rationale was starkly practical. By verbally chastising the deceased, listing their sins and failures, the community was essentially providing a reason for the spirit to be ashamed, to want to leave and not face further humiliation. Beating the coffin was a symbolic act of driving it away, of showing the spirit it was no longer welcome. Binding or positioning the body was a physical restraint on its potential supernatural power. This stood in shocking contrast to the standard Christian burial, which emphasized quiet reverence, prayers for the soul's peaceful journey, and the hope of resurrection. The Church preached that a properly confessed soul was bound for God's judgment, not lingering in the village, but folk belief often held a darker, more immediate view. What if the person had hidden sins? What if they died in a state of anger or vengeance? The formal rites of the Church felt like a distant diplomacy, while the ritual mockery was a direct, local intervention. It was a form of spiritual self-defense, a way for the living to assert dominance in the final moments they shared with the physical remains of the deceased. In doing so, they were not just burying a body, they were actively sealing a door between worlds, using scorn as their lock and accusations as their key, ensuring that the silence of the grave would be a permanent one. The scornful farewell to a restless spirit was a defense against chaos, but another ritual invited that very chaos inside, cloaking it in the merriment of a feast. Amid the roaring fires and laden tables of a 12th night celebration, a simple, humble being held the power to overturn the entire social order. This was the Feast of Fools made personal, a microcosm of licensed rebellion served with dessert. The centerpiece was not just any cake, but a specifically rich, dense fruitcake or galette des rois, packed with dried fruits, spices, and nuts. Baked into its very heart, hidden from view, was a single dried bean or sometimes a small porcelain figurine. The cake was then presented with great ceremony, often marked with a cross on top to signify its sacred, or perhaps sacrilegious, purpose. The master of the household would carefully cut the cake into slices, one for each guest and always one extra, known as the share of God or the poor man's share, meant for the first stranger to come to the door. With breath held and fingers crossed, each guest would inspect their slice, digging carefully through the moist crumb. the moment of discovery was met with a shout of triumph or a groan of mock despair. The finder of the bean was instantly transformed. They were crowned the king of the bean, or if a woman, the queen. A makeshift crown of leaves, paper, or even a real ceremonial crown was placed upon their head. In wealthier households, they might be draped in a special robe and given a scepter. Their coronation was complete with a mock oath, sworn amid laughter and raised cups. From that moment until the candles burned low, their word was law. The Bean King's rule was one of benevolent anarchy. They could demand songs from the shyest guest, order the lord of the manor to pour the wine, or decree that everyone must speak in rhyme for the next hour. They might impose ridiculous forfeits, like having the oldest person at the table dance a jig or the most serious tell a bawdy joke. The normal hierarchies of age, class, and gender were suspended. A servant could command their master to sing. A child could order their parents to swap seats. This was not mere childish play. It was a vital social pressure valve. In a society rigidly stratified by birth and title, the ritual allowed resentments and tensions to be released in a safe, controlled, and temporary explosion of nonsense. The chaos was licensed, meaning it was permitted precisely because it was contained within the ritual's time frame and rules. By dawn, the crown would be put away and the normal order restored, but everyone had participated in the cathartic fiction that things could be different. This seemingly frivolous game is a direct ancestor to many of our own Christmas traditions. The bean hidden in the cake evolved into the charms in New Year's cakes across Europe and even influenced the tradition of the Christmas pudding with its hidden silver coin. The idea of a Lord of Misrule presiding over holiday festivities echoes in our modern office Christmas parties, where the boss might be gently teased or forced to wear a silly hat. The King of the Bean reminds us that sometimes the strongest social bonds are not forged in solemnity, but in the shared, uproarious joy of turning the world upside down, if only for one night and with a piece of cake in hand. The crown of the Bean King was a temporary game, but the end of Carnival demanded a far more permanent and public execution. As the final, frantic days of feasting and masquerade drew to a close, communities across Europe prepared for a symbolic murder. They would construct an effigy, a grotesque, oversized puppet known as King Carnival, Caramantran, or sometimes simply Monsieur Carnival. This figure was the very embodiment of the excess they were about to renounce. He was stuffed to bursting with straw, old rags, and sometimes even the last scraps of rich food from the pantries. His costume was a glorious, satirical mess. Dressed in the finest clothes a village could mockingly assemble, often with a bloated belly, a leering mask, and a bottle of wine or a sausage clutched in his hand. He was gluttony, drunkenness, and revelry given a single, condemnable form. The ritual then moved to its central act, a full-blown parody of a court proceeding. The effigy would be placed in a cart and paraded through the streets as if to the gallows, surrounded by a jeering crowd wearing masks. A mock trial would be held. A prosecutor, often the town jester or a bold youth, would step forward and read a long, humorous list of charges against King Carnival. He would be accused of corrupting the youth, emptying wine cellars, inciting laziness, and leading good Christians into the sin of gluttony. Witnesses would come forward to offer exaggerated, comic testimony about the damage he had caused. A defense lawyer might half-heartedly argue for mercy, but the verdict was never in doubt. The judge, perhaps the local butcher or blacksmith in a ridiculous wig, would solemnly pronounce the sentence death. The method of execution varied by region and local tradition, each carrying its own powerful symbolism. In many places, the effigy was burned on a giant bonfire, its straw body consumed by purifying flames, sending the spirit of indulgence up in smoke. In coastal towns and river communities, the preferred method was drowning. King Carnival would be rowed out to the middle of the water, blessed with a mocking prayer, and then unceremoniously tipped overboard, sinking beneath the waves as the crowd cheered. In other villages, he was buried, interred in a shallow grave to rot away with the old season. This ritual killing was not an act of violence, but one of necessary transition. The medieval year was sharply divided between two opposing forces: the time of carnival, of the flesh, of community and chaos, and the time of Lent, of the spirit, of personal piety and denial. You could not simply slide from one into the other. The shift required a clear, dramatic break. By trying and executing King Carnival, the community was collectively taking responsibility for their own excess. They were publicly acknowledging that the time for feasting was over and actively, visibly destroying its symbol to make a clean psychic space for the 40 days of fasting and prayer ahead. It was a way to kill the party so that the penitence could truly begin. The laughter that accompanied the mock trial and execution was a crucial part of the medicine. It allowed people to let go of carnival with joy, not with regret, making the stark austerity of Lent feel like a chosen path rather than a grim punishment. In drowning their king of merriment, they were not mourning a loss, but performing a communal exorcism, ensuring that the ghost of indulgence would not haunt them through the long, lean weeks to come. The drowning of King Carnival was a public rejection of earthly power, but across the Channel, another monarch performed a ritual that claimed a power far beyond the political. For centuries, the kings of England and France were not just rulers, they were living conduits of divine healing, believed to possess a miraculous gift passed down through their sacred bloodline. This was the royal touch, a ceremony designed to cure scrofula, a disfiguring and often fatal tuberculous infection of the lymph nodes in the neck. Sufferers, known as the King's Evil, would travel for days, sometimes from other countries, to stand in long, desperate lines for a chance at a miracle. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of sacred theater, blending liturgy, monarchy, and medicine into a single, potent act. On appointed healing days, often around major religious festivals, the king would prepare through prayer and fasting. He would then be seated on a throne beneath a canopy of state, surrounded by bishops, courtiers, and guards. The afflicted were brought forward one by one. The ritual followed a precise script. The king would gently touch the sores on the patient's neck, sometimes making the sign of the cross over them. Then, as a court chaplain recited specific prayers from the Book of Common Prayer in England or the liturgy in France, the monarch would hang a gold coin, called an angel or a touch piece, around the sufferer's neck. The most famous prayer declared, "The king touches you, God heals you." This was the core of the entire belief. The king was not the source of the healing, he was merely the instrument, the proof that God's grace flowed directly through the anointed sovereign. The gold coin was not payment, it was a sacred talisman to be worn until the cure was complete, a constant physical reminder of the monarch's intercession. The political power this ritual conferred was immense. In an era of constant dynastic struggle and contested thrones, the ability to perform the royal touch was the ultimate validation of a king's legitimacy. It was a visible, tangible sign that God had truly chosen this man to rule. Pretenders and usurpers could not perform it convincingly, for the power was in the blood, not the crown. The ceremony transformed the abstract idea of the divine right of kings into a physical sensation, a touch that millions believed could alter the very course of disease. The ritual reached its peak in the medieval and early modern periods. In England, the practice is said to have begun with Edward the Confessor and was claimed most famously by the Tudors and Stuarts. Charles II touched nearly 100,000 people during his reign, but the Age of Enlightenment brought skepticism. Scientists and philosophers began to question the miraculous cures, attributing any recoveries to natural remission or the powerful placebo effect of such an awe-inspiring ceremony. The final blow came with the Hanoverian succession in England. George I, a Protestant from Germany, viewed the ritual as Catholic superstition and refused to perform it. Though his successors occasionally touched sufferers to appease public demand, the magic had faded. In France, the monarchy's end with the revolution in 1789 ended the practice for good. The royal touch did not decline because people stopped getting sick, but because the world slowly stopped believing that a king's hand could be a direct wire to heaven. The long lines of the hopeful vanished, leaving behind only the gold touch pieces in museums, quiet metal witnesses to a time when the cure for a terrifying illness was not found in a bottle, but in the touch of a man who was considered half a god. The king's touch offered a miracle of life, but the day after Christmas demanded a sacrifice of song. On St. Stephen's Day, December 26th, the villages of Ireland, Wales, the Isle of Man, and parts of France awoke to a different kind of hunt. Groups of boys, their faces often blackened with soot or hidden behind masks, would fan out into the frosty hedgerows and bare woods. Their quarry was not a deer or a fox, but the smallest of birds, the tiny brown wren. This was the ritual of the hunting of the wren, a ceremony of startling contrast where a creature celebrated as the king of all birds was pursued, killed, and paraded in a pageant of music and menace. The hunt itself was conducted with a solemn focus. The wren was notoriously difficult to catch, a quick, darting spirit of the underbrush. To kill one was considered a feat, but also a necessary act. Once captured, the tiny body was carefully placed in a miniature coffin, a decorated box, or more commonly, tied to the top of a holly bush or a pole adorned with ribbons, colored paper, and evergreen boughs. This decorated pole then became the center of a procession. The boys, now a formal troop, would carry their prize from house to house, singing a specific, haunting folk song known as the Wren Song. The lyrics varied by region, but their theme was consistent, a defiant, almost accusatory explanation of their deed. One version begins, the wren, the king of all birds, on St. Stephen's Day was caught in the furs. The song goes on to justify the hunt by blaming the wren for various misdeeds, from betraying Christian martyrs by its chirping to stealing the last sheaf of grain from the harvest. It was a ritual of shifting blame onto a symbolic scapegoat. At each doorstep, the singers would perform the song, and in return, they expected a coin or a treat from the household. Refusal was considered terribly bad luck, for the wren's visit was a conduit for transferring fortune. After the parade, the ritual reached its final, intimate stage. The tiny bird's feathers were meticulously plucked and distributed to the families who had given donations. A single feather was tucked above the doorframe or into the rafters of the home, a charm to protect the household from fire and witchcraft for the entire coming year. The wren's body was sometimes given a mock funeral, buried with ceremony in the churchyard. The origins of this puzzling blend of cruelty and celebration are ancient and dark, reaching back far beyond medieval Christianity. The wren held a sacred, paradoxical status in pre-Celtic and Druidic belief. Its Gaelic name, Druoilin, connects to words for trickster and druid. In legend, it was the cleverest of birds who had won the title king by flying higher than the eagle by perching on its back. It was a symbol of the old year, the past, and the waning sun. Its killing on the day after the winter solstice represented the symbolic overthrow of the old year's spirit, making way for the new sun's growth. The blackened faces of the hunters connected them to spirits of the dead or to otherworldly beings, marking this as a time outside of normal law. Medieval church authorities often recorded the ritual with a tone of bewildered distaste, unable to stamp out a practice that so deeply wove together threads of pagan sacrifice, seasonal magic, and communal charity. The coin collection, while festive, also served as vital winter alms for the youth of the poor. So the tiny wren, king for a day, became the vessel for it all, its sacrifice a release valve for the old year's darkness, its feathers a promise of light, and its song a strange, chilling carol for the turning of the world. The wren's sacrifice was a public offering for the community, but the next ritual turned the most private of events into a shared and bewildering performance. In homes from the Basque Country to the jungles of Southeast Asia, a new mother would rise from her bed mere hours after giving birth, resuming her daily chores while her husband climbed under the covers. He would lie there, groaning in sympathetic pain, observing a strict set of rules, refusing to handle knives or sharp tools, and often following a special diet. This was the couvade, a ritual of sympathetic childbirth where the father, not the mother, performed the role of the vulnerable patient. To the outside observer, it seems a baffling reversal, almost a parody of family roles. But for the communities that practiced it, this was a deadly serious act of spiritual protection. The logic was one of magical diversion. Birth was understood as a supremely dangerous transition, not just physically but spiritually. The mother and her newborn were seen as radiant beacons to every malevolent spirit, ghost or witch in the vicinity, their life force shining brightly in the shadow world. The mother, by getting up and working, presented a picture of rude health and normalcy, a disguise to fool the lurking forces. Meanwhile, the father, by taking to the bed and loudly mimicking the pangs of labor, created a far more enticing target. He was the decoy. Any harmful magic aimed at the birth would be drawn to his dramatic performance, hitting him instead of the truly vulnerable mother and child. His taboos, like avoiding sharp tools, were not about his comfort, but about maintaining his state of ritual vulnerability, keeping the trap set and functional. Anthropologists see layers of meaning woven into this strange bed rest. On one level, it is a profound psychological and social mechanism for affirming paternity. In societies without modern science, a father's biological connection is an act of faith. By undergoing a parallel ordeal, the man was tangibly linking himself to the child, sharing in the pain of its arrival, and thus cementing his claim and responsibility. It was a ritual of becoming a father, not just acknowledging one. On another level, it demonstrates a deep, ancient belief in sympathetic magic, the idea that actions performed on one object can affect another that resembles it. The father, by imitating the mother's state, created a spiritual bond between them, allowing him to siphon off danger through the power of mimicry. Some interpretations suggest it was also a way for the community to manage the unsettling power of childbirth, which was viewed as uniquely feminine and therefore mysteriously potent. By having the man publicly enact the crisis, it brought a natural, female-dominated process under a form of social and masculine control, integrating it safely into the broader community structure. The couvade forces us to question our most basic assumptions about family, pain, and protection. It reveals a world where danger was not just physical but spectral, and where a father's love might be proven not by providing, but by perfectly performed imitation, lying in wait to catch the arrows of the unseen world meant for his new family. After the father's ritualized bed rest, a different kind of performance unfolded in the midnight streets of medieval Italy, one where the only sound was the soft, haunting drag of chains. In stark contrast to the blood-spattered public spectacle of the flagellants, certain religious brotherhoods practiced a penance of profound and terrifying silence. These were the disciplinati, penitents who sought atonement not through outward show, but through an inward meditative journey made physically manifest in a nocturnal march. On appointed nights, members of these confraternities would gather in the dark. They dressed in simple, rough robes of undyed wool, and over their heads they pulled the most distinctive part of their garb, the cappuccio, a long, pointed hood that completely concealed the face, leaving only shadow where a person should be. This anonymity was the point. Stripped of identity, of social rank and personal sin, they became everymen, a procession of anonymous souls walking in the footsteps of Christ. They went barefoot, feeling every stone and chill of the cobblestones, a constant, painful reminder of the road to Calvary. And then, in utter silence, they would begin to walk. The procession moved through the sleeping city like a river of ghosts. No hymns were sung, no prayers recited aloud. The only sounds to break the thick quiet were the shuffling of bare feet and the deliberate, rhythmic clink of chains some wore around their ankles or dragged behind them. Others might engage in self-flagellation, but not with the brutal, iron-tipped scourges of the flagellants. They used softer cords or knotted ropes, the blows landing with a muted, padded thump, a private punctuation to their internal meditation on the Passion. The eerie power of this ritual lay in its inward focus. While the flagellant sought to provoke God's mercy through a public display of suffering, the silent penitent sought a personal, mystical union with Christ's pain. The hood was not just a mask, it was a tool to shut out the world, to force the mind away from distraction and into a deep, contemplative state. The darkness of the night and the anonymity of the hood created a sacred space for a direct, unmediated confrontation with one's own soul and the divine. The very atmosphere they cultivated, one of eerie quiet punctuated by these stark, simple sounds, was designed to induce a kind of waking trance, a walking meditation where the line between the penitent and the suffering Savior could, for a moment, blur. This distinctive pointed hood, the cappuccio, would echo far beyond these midnight processions. In the 1520s, a Franciscan friar named Matteo del Basio, seeking a return to the strict, simple roots of St. Francis, adopted a similar rough robe and a long, pointed hood as his habit. His followers became known as the Order of Friars Minor Capuchin, named for that very hood, a permanent, visible symbol of penitence and humility that they wore in daylight. The Capuchin order grew into a major force within the Catholic Church, while the silent, lay processions that inspired their name gradually faded from the public squares. Yet the image endures, a haunting testament to a medieval belief that the deepest connection to the divine might not be found in shouted pleas or dramatic bloodshed, but in the vulnerable, silent march of a soul through the dark, with nothing but the sound of its own chains to keep it company. From the chaotic frenzy of the dancing plague to the solemn silence of hooded penitents, these 25 bizarre rituals paint a vivid picture of a medieval world grappling with forces it could not control. Disease, weather, justice, and the divine were not abstract concepts, they were daily realities that demanded a response. When prayers felt insufficient and science was in its infancy, people turned to the language they understood best, the language of action and symbol. They crafted rituals to argue with the weather, to prosecute insects in court, to absorb sin through bread, and to read the future in a rolling cheese. These acts defy our modern logic precisely because they were born from a completely different worldview, one where the boundary between the physical and spiritual was porous, where magic and faith were not beliefs, but tangible forces you could bargain with, threaten, or appease. Each ritual, no matter how strange it seems, was a logical step within that reality, a desperate and creative attempt to impose order on a terrifyingly unpredictable universe. They remind us that human ingenuity in the face of fear can take astonishing forms, from the beautifully communal, like wassailing the apple trees, to the painfully introspective, like the silent march of the penitents. So we turn the question to you. Which of these lost rituals shocked or fascinated you the most? Was it the legal excommunication of caterpillars, the father's decoy bed rest in the couvade, or the blazing faith of the firewalkers? Let us know in the comments below, and if you crave more journeys into the shadows of history, more stories of how people made sense of a mysterious world, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for our next deep dive into the past.